Um, we are doing a chat today on unpacking net zero GHG emission, a very, very important and contemporary issue of interest. And it's our great honor and pleasure to have Ms. Dr. Anirban Ghosh. Dr. Anirban Ghosh, Dr. Ghosh, welcome to this LinkedIn Live session. It's a pleasure to have you with us. And we are going to talk to Dr. Ghosh about the industry perspective on net zero GHG emission. And before we start and get into this conversation, just to set up the context here. So there has been a fair bit of conversation about net zero GHG emission now, especially in the last few years, especially as a means to achieve the climate goals that have been set in Paris. And there has been a fair bit of traction, both at the level of the government and also by the industry, in moving in that direction, and using really science as the guiding light in achieving the set target. And through the initiative of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, for example, governments and industry have and other stakeholders have taken a fair sort of strong step in the direction of achieving net zero ambitions, and to move into a growth path which is carbon neutral, and decouples the economic growth from environmental degradations and so on. So given that context, we are here today to talk to one of the leading industry, one of the leading companies in India, Mahindra and Mahindra Group, which has really been a pioneer on the subject. And we have Dr. Ghosh here, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer of the group and has been leading the group's work on this area. And under his leadership, the organization, the Mahindra Group, has developed an award-winning sustainability framework and helped become the first to double energy productivity and be a founding member of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, and is striving to become even zero waste to landfill organization. So a lot of things happening in Mahindra and Mahindra on sustainability. So that's excellent, Dr. Ghosh. If I may start with asking you a question about your own company has made a carbon neutral commitment to be carbon neutral by 2040, driven by the chairman and managing director, Mr. Anand Mahindra himself. How has this experience really been for the company, and especially given that Mahindra and Mahindra Group is a group company which has a diverse range of business? So how has this experience been from sort of translating such an ambitious sort of commitment to the operational level? So if you can share your thoughts about that.
Thank you for your question, Rijit. You are most gracious. I must say Mr. Ghosh will be sufficient and more accurate, perhaps. Carbon neutrality is actually an interesting journey. If you are on the climate journey, and if you acknowledge that carbon in the atmosphere is the big problem, then I think it's logical to ask the question, okay, what should our contribution be? And is it at all, given the situation, is it at all possible to reach a state where you are not making a contribution to carbon in the atmosphere? I think over time we've realized that it is not a dream, but a possibility. And therefore, that is why Mr. Mahindra, who was then the chairman and managing director, and as of a few days ago has become the non-executive chairman. It is perhaps that's the reason why he said that, okay, let's go for it. And of course, there were many other business leaders within the group who had bought into the dream by then. It is a very ambitious target. I'm not sure we can say that, okay, if you do X, Y, and Z, you will definitely get there. Uh, but we do know that on the journey to carbon neutrality, here are the things that you definitely must do. And instead of waiting to find out all the answers, we said, okay, let's get started. By the time, as we go along, we will find out more and more answers. Yes, we do have a lot of diversity of businesses in the group. But if we look at the broad uh, set of actions, which when translated into those businesses may have different implementations, but the broad set of actions is energy efficiency, renewable energy, and carbon removals. Now, how you do energy efficiency depends on the business you're in. Renewable energy, again, is by and large similar for everybody. Over time, there are industries where hydrogen will play a very big part compared to, let's say, solar or wind. But at this point in time, what we can do is largely in the realm of solar and wind. So let's just do all of that. And there is the acknowledgement that even if we do everything that is possible to do, there will still be some residual emissions. Um, and therefore, some level of carbon removals will be necessary to become a net zero organization. And this is only, at, let's say, the annual level. So you're becoming net zero this year and you become net zero next year and so on. If we look at accumulated emissions, then there is a whole new story of taking carbon out of the air and using it in a economically feasible manner, so that there is, businesses have the need then or the motivation to get more carbon out of the air and use it for something useful. These are some of the ways in which we look at this journey on carbon neutrality. We know it's a long one and a tough one, but we do believe that there will be a lot that will happen. Oh, and before I close the answer, I mustn't forget that clean transportation, especially electric mobility, is a very big part of the solution. And as you know, we have very high investments planned in that area.
Great, thanks, Mr. Ghosh, for your answer. So absolutely, I mean, there is no doubt about the fact that this is ambitious, this is difficult, this is tough. Achieving net zero, let's say carbon emission, or not be more specific. And you mentioned that there's sort of there are three areas and three sort of pathways that the organization has chosen for itself. Now, there will definitely, like any other any other roadmap, there'll be sort of challenges, and there will also be opportunities. Um, and it must have taken a fair bit of doing to sort of convince the business heads about those opportunities, especially, and to bring to their notice about the challenges that will lie on that road. So from that experience, and given the fact that there are a number of other industries and companies who are really looking at this issue very seriously,
Is
what
it
would you
mine? Can
Yeah,
you hear me?
I can hear you. Your network is a little off, or is it mine? Um, can you hear me? I'll try and sort of stop the video and see if this works better. Are you able to hear me, Mr. Ghosh? Hello.
For a while, I couldn't hear you, but I can hear you now.
Oh, okay, great. So I was saying that, it's let me just repeat what I mentioned earlier, and apologies to the participants who are listening to us. So what I was saying is that it's a complex and a difficult journey, as you acknowledged, and rightly so. um, and 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 your experience of sort of convincing and talking to the various sort of business heads of the company, you must have highlighted to them the opportunities and the challenges that would lie in over the course of this journey. So based on that, what are your sort of how would you sort of pose that to the wider industry in India? What do you think are the opportunities and the challenges for Indian industry um, as they look at the uh, embracing net zero GHG emission and moving in that direction? Mr. Ghosh? I think we are having a bit of a problem with Mr. Ghosh's network. So we will just give him a few minutes, a few seconds to see if we can. I think he's trying to join from another uh, account. Let's see if this works. Mr. Ghosh, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. So I
Okay.
don't know whether I suppose it must be my network. I've switched network now just to be safe.
Okay, great.
I
Thanks a lot. No worries, no
I
worries.
al- I heard that question of yours, half your question two times. So I guess that counts. I guess you were going towards how did we get the leaders of all these different businesses to agree towards moving to carbon
Right.
neutrality.
And
Actually,
and to sort of
Richard,
and to stretch that a little bit further, maybe as part of your your remark, to say how could this be communicated to the wider industry, in India? Yeah, thanks.
so, Rijit, when we started out, we started small. Some 10, 12 years ago, when the first goals were set, we said, okay, we will reduce 1% of our emissions every year. We had no idea whether that was a big target, small target. At that time, nobody really had any targets. So we got started, and we found that doing more than 1% in a year was not a problem. And so we kept at it. We started with energy efficiency projects largely. And by, more than 100, 200 projects had happened. And they were all financially viable. And each of them had very good environmental impact. And we saw that we were actually able to do 30-40% energy productivity without looking at it as a program. Around that time, the Climate Group announced the EP100 program and came around asking if we would commit to doubling energy productivity. So we said, okay, let's take a look at how much are we able to do. And when we saw we are getting to 30-40% without really stepping on the gas, uh, then we asked the question, okay, how much is possible? And is doubling energy productivity such a dream, or is it something we should just take on? And a little bit of calculation showed that it wasn't exactly a pipe dream. Um, the goal was doubling in 25 years, which means an average of a little more than 3%. Cumulatively, it will get to 100%. We said this is easy to do. and we'll probably get there long before 25 years. So why don't we commit and then put our resources in? And then as we put our resources in, one business actually doubled energy productivity in 4 years' time. So we said, okay, it's not as if everyone's going to double in 4 years' time, but and many other businesses were 40% there, 50% there, 60% there in spans of 5 years, 7 years, and so on. So we said, okay, this seems to be a feasible thing and can be scaled, and you can get a lot of impact. We also knew renewable energy would immediately bring down the emissions from the business. And then we started doing more and more calculations that, okay, if we continue on this path of doubling energy productivity, and then scenario one, not increase energy productivity anymore, where will we get? If we assume that it will still be possible to enhance energy productivity, then where will we get? And suppose we do 50% of our energy as renewable energy, then what will our emissions be? If it is 100%, what will it be? And we realized that renewable energy really bends the curve. So the more renewable energy you do, so even in a growing economy, growing business, where you worry about absolute emissions, the only way in which you can actually do absolute zero or head towards absolute zero is if you do renewable energy at scale. And we drew these curves for all our big businesses, and the pattern was the same. Some people had greater impact through energy efficiency, some had lesser, but renewable energy worked wonders for everybody. So with these two big levers, we just jumped into it and said, let's do as much of this as we can. Okay, wherever it is possible, wherever the regulations allow, wherever the policy allows. What helps is that when you buy renewable energy, it costs lesser than conventional energy. If that changes, then we have a problem. I hope that doesn't change, because it gives the industry an incentive to move towards renewable energy, which in turn has a whole lot of positive impact, which I hope we will all realize. Now, as these two journeys started, energy efficiency, renewable energy, when we shared the numbers with people within the business, and see if we continue on our path, this is where we'll get. But more and more opportunities are coming. So, we'll actually reduce our emissions a lot more. So using energy efficiency, renewable energy, will get 80-90% of the job done. And then we are left with a little bit, we can just take care of it through carbon removals, unless some other new technology comes and we get even closer to net zero. So that's what attracted everybody's attention. Of course, there were questions like, so is it going to be expensive? How much will it cost us? And so on. Fortunately, I mean, if renewable energy costs lesser than conventional energy, then no problem. It is not more expensive. Definitely not if you're not setting up your own plant. But then we'd set up enough of our own plants to know that the returns were enough for the business to invest in it. And energy efficiency, again, every single investment gives returns in excess of the hurdle rate. So it's not a question of is it expensive, it's a question of how much of my resources can I put into energy efficiency and renewable energy in a particular year. These are the industries that we are a part of. Some industries may have other challenges, but broadly, this is the direction. It'll work pretty much for everybody. And if somebody hasn't got started, all I would say is get started, because just like us, you will find out that once you start, you'll find much more is possible than you thought before you got started, and you will get great returns for your investments. So it's not as if you're going to add a burden on your business. If it was a burden on the business, we couldn't have done as much as we have, and we wouldn't have committed to do as much as we've committed to do.
Great. No, thanks for that and the advice. And I think 2-3 things which you raised. One, that this is definitely something which is long term. It is something that you have as a company. You ought to have the stamina to to sort of think through and run with it is one. And also, while sort of using renewable energy is cheaper, um, but there will be some costs in any case, to start with, for whether it is moving into energy efficient processes, or sort of even switching some of the some of the processes, etc. And so how, in your experience, uh, when you were talking to, I mean, in your case, this was comparatively easier because the leader of the organization really saw value in this direction. Um, but let us assume that that is not generally the case in many companies. How would you sort of advocate and engage with a leader of the business on making this transition?
I don't know who it was that said, Rijit, but there is this very famous saying which says, "Let a thousand flowers bloom." Right?
Right.
It's completely different context, but that was what used to be said. Uh, Probably in some context of a revolution or something. What we are in is nothing short of an industrial revolution of some kind. And yes, of course, it helps when the leader of the business gives you support. You have a benign umbrella to be under, you're protected, you can be courageous. But the fun thing is this: tell me one head of a factory who will not want to reduce his conversion cost. My colleague who was the head of manufacturing used to say, most of my costs are fixed by other people. There are very few costs that I can manage. One of the costs I can manage is energy. And what you're telling me is that by taking sustainability action, I will cut energy costs by 30%, sometimes 50%, and so on. And so if it is 70% of my controllable costs and I'm cutting it by half, why should I not do it? I
Right.
don't even need anybody's support. As long as I have the money to invest, I will do it. So it is only about having the money to invest. And then any individual leader at any level can actually move a project which is great for the climate, but also great for the business. And I don't see why people will say no. We'd also created a way to assess these projects. Many sustainability people, they end up spending their time with relevant departments like, say, asset management or capital purchase or somebody, trying to get money for the projects they're proposing. That, oh, please pass this project, oh, this is an important one, and so on. So most of the time goes in trying to get the funding for the project which they've come up with. I think that's a colossal waste of time. The sustainability team or the project team, their job should be to generate as many projects as possible. And then those projects, you should be able to prioritize using some metric or something and get the funds accordingly. So we came up with a metric. We said, okay, we will use two parts in the metric. We will use payback period and we will use emission reduction. Okay. So finance is happy if payback period is less than 2 years or a little bit around 2 years. And if emission is reduced, sustainability people are happy. So if you were to take payback period divided by emission reduction, then if payback period went down, it was great. If payback period went down, emission reduction also went down, it was great. So you were always in a situation where greater is better. And so when we ended up with, so when the sustainability team came up with 40 projects, obviously too much for that year's budget, we just prioritized using a metric like this and got going. Because these projects are in that realm where they are good for business and they are good for planet, and there are plenty of projects like that today. There may come a time when the projects, the payback period becomes a lot longer. We will have to think differently then. We will have to prioritize differently then, because other competing projects of the group will also demand attention. But at this point in time, we are still in that space with energy efficiency, with renewable energy, with creating value from waste, with reducing water, fresh water usage, and so on. So we are able to take this journey forward and keep moving towards a zero carbon world.
Great, great. No, thanks. And I think what you've also highlighted are two things. One is the support that is needed. Of course, leadership is one of them. But you also mentioned about policy. The fact that the cost of renewable energy remains low, and that's really enabling. You also mentioned about finance. So there would be finance which is available and finance which can be made available. So uh, just to talk about a little bit, I mean, we are now trying to go outside of the company a little in the ecosystem and in the supply chain, where things get a little bit more fuzzy. Uh, when we talk about the ecosystem, there are certain specific sort of elements from where you can draw support. As you said, policy is one of them, finance is one of them, um, technology is one of them. I mean, when you talk about energy efficiency, the technology comes into being. Even skills, right? You are also talking about enhancing and augmenting the skill set of people to to operate and work on certain systems and processes that they might not have done before. So, how important is an enabling ecosystem for sort of fast tracking and getting onto this journey, especially for business leaders? And what are those, let's say, what are the key sort of levers in that ecosystem that you feel will really, sort of um, make it count for companies to take that decision to move into net zero pathway?
So, policy support is required when a solution cannot stand on its own feet economically. That is one scenario. In the climate change scenario, there is another area where policy support is required, where a solution can stand on its own feet economically, but we as a society can't afford the time that it will normally take for this technology to become commonplace. There is a cycle, we know. Every technology follows an S curve, and there is a long period of time when it incubates and the innovators participate, and then the early majority participate, and so on. But if we have to solve climate change and we have to use a whole lot of new technologies, we can't afford to let these technologies go through a regular cycle. So you need policy there to accelerate the adoption, right? So support technologies which are not yet fully economically viable on their own feet, and accelerate technologies which are viable on their own, but we can't afford to uh, give them time uh, to kind of penetrate through the society. So these are two places where you need policy support. Now, if you're looking for examples, let's just say why do we need to support electric vehicles today? We need to support electric vehicles today because we know that it is the future. We need to get started now. If we want to bring costs down, we should give a demand signal of some kind. Because this is what happened with solar power, this is what happened with LED lights. So we should do it with electric vehicles. Very soon, electric vehicles will need no support because they will become better uh, than internal combustion vehicles anyway. And you and I as consumers will buy those vehicles because they are better, they don't cost more, and so on. But till that time, they need a little bit of policy support. Let's take another example, say of green buildings. As consumers, we should be running to buy green buildings. And maybe 10 years later, people will, when they are buying an apartment, ask, is this a green building? Do you have this accreditation or not? How much energy does it consume? At this point in time, most people don't ask these questions. But the technology is ready. It doesn't cost more than a regular building. And therefore, policy intervention is definitely required to accelerate the penetration of green buildings in society. In fact, policy is also required to ensure that we don't build anything that is not green. And you know all the reasons why we should not build green. I mean, why do you want to bake emissions in for the future when it doesn't cost more to build a low carbon solution in the building space? So these are two ways in which policy can be used to ensure that the uh, better solutions, the low carbon solutions become a part of our life. And it's not as if you and I, as consumers, will be getting something which is worse than what we have today. We'll actually get things which are better than what we have today. Right? So that's why the policy should be used. If you try using policy to drive something down people's throat, which they don't want, the policy will not succeed. You can do as much policy as you want. And that brings me then to money. And that's another very interesting conversation. You ask the finance people, they say we don't get good projects. And you ask the sustainability people, they say we don't get good money. Now, both of these things can't be correct at the same time, right? So I know there is a lot of conversation on there should be money for this and investment and this and so on. But I just keep thinking that, okay, just put up a good project, the money will come. And I don't see why the finance person will not invest in something which is good for the future and gives good returns. So the more such projects come up, the more the solutions come up. We've already started hearing about banks doing ESG linked lending. Yeah, we didn't hear this 1 year ago. So somebody figured out, oh, it's possible actually to kind of make our lending of lower risk if we link it to ESG. Awesome development. Similar thing is happening in the amongst investors who they may not have figured it out completely, but they know that ESG, or let's say climate change, brings about, or there are new risks to businesses because of climate change. And ESG action helps to mitigate this risk. So an organization which is taking good ESG action should be less risky in the future. So that's where my money should go. Now, what the exact actions should be vary from industry to industry, and I'm sure investors will figure it out very soon. Right now, it's a bit of a smokescreen. There are too many things we are discussing, but it's early days. That will also kind of work out. So therefore, with policy being used properly, and with investors and lenders figuring out how ESG can actually make their investments safer, we are going to move forward on this journey.
Great. No, thanks a lot for that, and also heartening to note that there is a process of developing sort of some development in sustainable finance space in India as well. The Ministry of Finance is leading on that process, and as you said, the supply will create its own demand and raise sort of awareness amongst the financiers, the lenders, the investors about the need to support the right kind of projects. I'm going to make it a little bit more complicated now by talking a little bit about SMEs. When we talk about Indian industry, it's predominantly SMEs, and they have borne the brunt of the COVID and also the demonetization and all of that, and pretty sort of in a very sort of scary state, if I may, in terms of what is coming next. In this kind of an environment, how how do we sort of mainstream and integrate the SMEs into who are very very critical part of, and you'll agree, of our value chain, not just the supply chain in which businesses operate. So for a business to create a comprehensive sort of picture about a net zero ambition, there will be possibilities and opportunities for businesses to integrate and mainstream and hold the hands of their SME sort of partners in the value chain. Um, how would you start that kind of a conversation with the SME champions and the leaders of the SMEs in India on net zero and other such ambitious, uh, given the current times that we are in, or does the current times give us that kind of an opportunity actually to talk about it better?
Yeah, the key to everything right now for SMEs is cash flow. And sustaining the business, making sure that the business continues to exist is obviously the first priority. Um, I, if they have the wherewithal to do capital expense, then yes, then projects can happen. If the wherewithal doesn't exist, I guess we'll have to wait for that little while when we bridge it over. See, the recovery wasn't very slow, if you noticed in phase one. As numbers went down, recovery was quite rapid.
Yeah,
And because it's not as if demand has gone away, the structural factors of the economy are still very strong
right.
and they haven't changed. So this is a unfortunate, unforeseen, unnecessary disruption that has happened. So we should not use these disruption to think that okay, something very big has changed in the long term. It is not. Okay, which means that we will get back and to business, value will start getting created, revenues will start flowing, and we can start thinking of doing all the right things in sustainability in the SME world. Now, if I look at SMEs, say from the Mahindra lens, we say SMEs we work with who are in our supply chain and those we don't work with. Now, those who we work with, they actually manufacture, I don't know, 70% of the product probably gets made in their factories. Uh, Most of the assembly happens in ours. So if our product has to have low embedded carbon, then a lot of work has to happen in their factories. So just as we are doing energy efficiency, they need to do energy efficiency as well. And that actually works well for them because the pressure to reduce prices is always there from the OEM. So this actually gives them a method by which they can keep their own costs down and therefore become more competitive, not only for this OEM, but for other OEMs as well. Because as you know, in the automobile industry in India, single sourcing is not necessarily the primary driver, unlike, let's say, in Japan, where single sourcing is far more prevalent than in India, which means that the benefits an SME gets is good for multiple OEMs. Now, some OEMs, and this depends entirely on industry structure and who has the power and so on, some OEMs might turn around and say that unless you do this, I will not buy from you, which is kind of what Apple does in its own ecosystem. But then when you're making things for Apple, you can't sell it to anybody else. You have to sell it to Apple because it doesn't fit into any other box, right? So there, the dynamic is completely different. But whichever way you look at it, if it's your own supply chain, then for them to adopt practices which the OEM has adopted or practices they've discovered themselves to reduce operational cost, reduce conversion cost, attract investment, get labor. If they are able to leverage sustainability to do all of this, I don't see why they won't do it. The same awareness process that had to happen for large organizations will have to happen for them as well. But they're smart businessmen. I don't see why they will not understand. Though I must say that it doesn't always proceed very smoothly. So if you were to make an offer to SMEs and say, okay, I am happy to tell you about ways in which you can leverage sustainability to become a stronger, more resilient business with good benefits to the bottom line. Recent experience shows that you don't have a line of people outside your door wanting to learn. So maybe there is a challenge somewhere. Maybe I don't understand it so well, being a part of a large organization, and probably have to work harder to get a sense of the entrepreneurs in the SME space. Maybe the entrepreneurs in the SME space are so overwhelmed with COVID that this is not the right time to talk to them. That's entirely possible. I must give them their due. But that opportunities exist in the SME space, I guess all of us know. But this is where the beauty of renewable energy comes in. That if the grid were to become 70-80% renewable, then even if the SME takes no action, they also become 70-80% users of 70-80% of renewable energy. And that's why systemic solutions for the nation can have some very strong impact in the climate journey. And I think that those are the numbers that our government has crunched to make the commitments that it has made.
Sure, thanks. Very, very interesting points you made about SMEs um, in a competitive market where if there was fair competition, uh, will have the opportunity to sort of identify their who to sell their products to, um, um, and we hope that there are opportunities for SMEs, more opportunities for SMEs in more markets that they have that luxury of identifying who they can sell to. And if that's the case, then um, uh, the movement towards sort of decarbonization could be used strategically by the SMEs to sort of woo the buyers in the market. And maybe what you also mentioned is another thing. I think in your remark, um, implicitly, is that there is probably a lot of scope for improvisation and innovation, which should happen and should be encouraged, whether it is by the SME leaders or by the wider economy, or even the government. So these are very, very interesting thoughts. Thank you.
And it works very well, Rijit.
Right,
One of our smaller businesses
right,
used to make a product which goes into automobiles. And they went to one of the largest automobile manufacturers of the world and became a member of their supply chain only because of the sustainability work that they used to do.
right,
Uh, the CEO was very clear that their purchasing department won't even speak to me. I'm too small.
right.
Right? But their sustainability department will speak to me. And I'm quite happy to go and speak to them because I have something good to share. And he leveraged that.
This is very interesting. What the point that you're making here. This is very, very critical. I think, especially for for aspiring businesses to understand that. To understand the landscape of a business. So a business is not a monolith, and it does not, it's a whole system, and there are different components of the system which will react differently to different proposals, and sustainability proposal. As you said, this is very interesting. That this, maybe the sustainability head will then put pressure or influence on the procurement head to say, hey, this is something that you probably would consider. This is very, very interesting. Thank you.
After all, that OEM also has its own sustainability commitments.
Exactly.
Also wants its supply chain to do things in sustainability. And here is a guy who comes and says, look, I do all of this. Why don't you buy from me? And so if he meets quality and price criteria, he's in.
Exactly. Great. So thanks a lot, Mr. Ghosh, for your time, and this has been a very fascinating conversation. Before we end, in maybe two or three specific bullet points, uh, advice to leaders of India Incorporated about embracing net zero emission. How would if you had to um, talk to them, what are those two, three things that you would tell them based on your experience in Mahindra Group?
It's a fantastic journey. It's good for business. It cuts cost. It helps create value. It reduces uh, carbon regulation risks of the future. There's plenty more, but this is enough. Just get started.
Great.
Yeah, if you're worried about it being expensive or anything, start with a small project and experience what almost everybody's experienced, that once you get started, you can do a lot more than you originally thought was possible. So just get started.
Great. Just get started. Thank you very much. On that note, Mr. Ghosh, it's been a fascinating conversation as always, and thanks for your time. We really hope that this has been live on LinkedIn, and we hope people will listen to the advice, the business leaders and other important key stakeholders. We'll try to communicate this, your words to them. Uh, just get started. Start small, and there are benefits to be made. So on that note, thank you very much, Mr. Ghosh. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Take care and stay well. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me, Rajit. And sorry about that network disruption. I
Yeah,
don't know
sorry,
how
our
that happened,
apologies.
but
Take care. Thanks a lot. Bye.
bye bye.